Well, good afternoon. This is Mr. Burns. We're doing another women's history lesson. And one of the important things that we've learned so far is that during the 1800s, there were lots of reform movements. There were reform movements for better treatment for the mentally ill. There were reform movements to end slavery in this country. There were reform movements to win the vote for black Americans. There were reform movements to win the vote for women. Another reform movement that was strong during the late 1800s and early 1900s is what was called temperance. So I want to grab a pen here and I want to circle this word temperance. Temperance was the crusade to stop the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Alcoholism was a serious problem in the United States in the all through the 1800s and on into the 1900s. On your left, you see a picture of Frances Willard, and she was the one of the women who was a leading crusader in this temperance movement. She formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the 1870s. Her movement was in response to the American Civil War, which was fought between 1861 and 1865. And one of the big things we saw after the Civil War, after and during the Civil War, was an increase in the abuse of alcohol. Now, that's a bad thing because alcoholics treat their families and their spouses terribly. There's lots of violence. Alcoholics aren't dependable at work, and they also get themselves in a lot of accidents. So, addressing this alcohol problem in the United States was very important. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, drunkenness has always been an issue in American society. Temperance is the movement against alcohol consumption. Some of the interesting facts that I learned was if you go way back to the American Revolution, each soldier in the army was allotted 4 ounces of alcohol per day. And this went on up until 1832. So, what that really meant was that a soldier was given like a bottle of whiskey a week. George Washington, the first year that he was in charge of the Continental Army, had an alcohol budget for himself and his staff of $6,000. So a lot of alcohol was consumed during the early part of our history. Temperance followers were very much against the consumption of alcohol, and they wanted to see its sales restricted. They wanted to close saloons, and the main motivator was all the abuse that they saw heaped on women and children because of alcoholic men. Before I go over this slide, I just thought I would tell everybody that, growing up in southwestern Minnesota, Worthington, the temperance movement was very strong in this area. In fact, for a while, alcohol sales and manufacture was illegal in the United States, and the law that made it illegal was called the Volstead Act, and Congressman Volstead was from this part of Minnesota. He had his home in Granite Falls. Take a nice look at this lady on the right, dressed up in black. Carrie Nation is her name, and she's holding a hatchet there. So she was a militant temperance reformer, so she was very much opposed to alcoholism and alcohol consumption. And that's because for much of her adult life, things were terrible for her. Her husband was a violent drunk who often came home drunk and abused her and her children. And so he actually drank himself to death, which was not uncommon in that day and age. So her militance takes the form of busting up saloons. So what Miss Nation would do she would get a group of her supporters, and they would go into a local tavern and they would start smashing the bottles and the fixtures. So she was an ardent reformer for alcohol reform in this country, and it's all due to her abusive past. The temperance movement then reached its peak strength in the early 1900s, and there's probably two reasons for this. The first is just because of how immigration had changed, and what happened was from the late 1890s on into the 1900s, many new immigrants came to the United States, and they're from places like Italy and Ireland with Catholic populations that drank a lot, and they also came from Russia and Poland and other Slavic peoples from southeastern Europe where alcohol consumption was uh, more prevalent, and the native population kind of reacted against that with these foreigners that drank too much. But then there was also World War One, and World War One was an important part for the temperance movement. The common thing that they talked about during the war was we need this grain to feed the people, and we need this grain for our soldiers, and we need to ship some of this grain over to Europe to help feed our allies. And so to turn grain into alcohol was actually a thing that could cause us to lose the war. So the temperance movement reached its peak strength, and amazingly, they were able to amend the Constitution, and three-fourths of the states ratified the Constitution, and the 18th Amendment was ratified right at the end of World War One in 1919. And what this amendment did was you can't manufacture and you can't sell alcohol anymore. The special word that describes this era was called prohibition. So prohibition means you cannot make alcohol and you cannot sell alcohol. It's illegal in the United States. And this was the law of the land until 1933. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, and it repealed the 18th Amendment. Repeal means canceled out. So that's a little history of the temperance movement in the United States. Women were important organizers of the temperance movement. The temperance movement was important because in the 1800s and the early 1900s, drunkenness was way too common, and drunkenness has bad side effects, especially on the family. When you consider the women that are abused at the hands of their husbands, sometimes it's the other way around. It's the wife that abuses her husband, and probably the people who suffer the most are the children. The children of alcoholics suffer greatly. So the temperance movement was a movement to ban alcohol in the United States. I think I'll add just one thing more before I go, and that is with the temperance movement and passage of the 18th Amendment, one of the unexpected consequences of the 18th Amendment was to help start organized crime in America. So we had criminal gangs in America's biggest cities finding ways to smuggle in alcohol to the country and sell to thirsty customers. One of the most famous of these criminal bootleggers was the man he was born in New York City, but he came to power when he went to Chicago, and that is the famed gangster Al Capone.